It is 2:45 in the morning on August 6, 1945, on the island of Tinian, some 2,400 kilometers south of Tokyo. Ground crews move under floodlights around a modified B-29 Superfortress named Enola Gay, its 4 engines already turning over with a low, building roar. Inside the aircraft's bomb bay hangs a single object, just over 3 meters long and weighing close to 4 tons, painted matte olive drab and nicknamed, almost absurdly, Little Boy. 12 men climb aboard. Most of them do not know exactly what they are carrying, only that it is unlike anything that has flown before. Colonel Paul Tibbets taxis the heavily laden bomber down a runway built specifically for this mission, using almost every meter of it before the wheels finally leave the coral tarmac. 6 hours later, over a city of some 350,000 people, that single object will detonate roughly 600 meters above the ground, and the world will step, irreversibly, into the nuclear age. What happens in the minutes, months, and years that follow will shape the rest of the 20th century and everyone since. This is the story of how it was built, why it was used, and what it left behind. To understand why Little Boy came to exist, you have to understand the sheer exhaustion of a world at war for the better part of 6 years. By 1945, the conflict in the Pacific had become a grinding, brutal contest of attrition. American planners, having fought through Iwo Jima and Okinawa at a horrifying cost, were drawing up plans for Operation Downfall, a full invasion of the Japanese home islands. Some estimates prepared at the time projected casualties in the hundreds of thousands for Allied forces alone, with Japanese military and civilian losses potentially running far higher still. Conventional bombing had already devastated much of urban Japan. The firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945 killed an estimated 100,000 people in a single night, yet Japan's government showed no sign of capitulation. Existing weapons, however devastating, required hundreds of aircraft and thousands of tons of ordnance to achieve what planners hoped a single bomb might now accomplish. The physics that made such a weapon theoretically possible had been understood in outline since the late 1930s, when scientists in Germany, Britain, and the United States began to grasp that splitting the nucleus of certain heavy atoms could release energy on a scale never before harnessed. The challenge was not the theory. It was turning that theory into a device that would actually work, reliably, once, without the luxury of testing it under combat conditions. Nobody had ever built anything like it. Nobody knew for certain, until it happened, that it would. The effort to solve that problem became the Manhattan Project, a sprawling, secret, extraordinarily expensive undertaking spanning dozens of sites across the United States, from Oak Ridge in Tennessee to Hanford in Washington State to the Central Design Laboratory at Los Alamos, New Mexico, led by the physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer. Little Boy itself relied on a design approach that was, in engineering terms, comparatively straightforward, even if the science behind it was not. It used highly enriched uranium, a form of the element refined so that it contained a far higher proportion of a particular isotope than occurs naturally, produced through enormous industrial facilities at Oak Ridge that consumed a significant share of the electricity generated in the United States at the time. The finished weapon weighed around 4,400 kilograms and measured roughly 3 meters in length and about 70 centimeters in diameter, a size and shape not unlike a large industrial boiler, or, as later writers would note, an oversized dustbin fitted with fins. Because the design was considered by its creators to be dependably simple, it was never test-fired in full before its use in combat, unlike the plutonium implosion design that would be tested weeks earlier in the New Mexico desert. Producing the uranium fuel took the better part of 2 years and drew on the labor of tens of thousands of workers, the overwhelming majority of whom had no idea what they were ultimately building. Final assembly of the weapon components took place at Los Alamos before the device was shipped, in pieces aboard the cruiser USS Indianapolis to the forward base on Tinian, where a specially trained unit, the 509th Composite Group, had spent months rehearsing a mission whose true purpose remained known to only a handful of them. If you're finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. At 8:15 local time on the morning of August 6th, the bomb was released over Hiroshima, a city that had been largely spared conventional bombing precisely so that the effects of this new weapon could be observed without the confusion of previous damage. It detonated roughly 43 seconds later. The destruction that followed was documented by American observers, Japanese survivors, and in the years afterward, by extensive historical and medical research, though even now some figures remain estimates rather than exact counts given the chaos of the moment and the loss of civic records. Tens of thousands of people are believed to have died within the first day. By the end of 1945, the toll from the initial blast, the firestorm that followed, and acute radiation illness is generally estimated to have reached somewhere between 90,000 and 140,000. Out of a population of roughly 350,000. 3 days later, a second different weapon, the plutonium implosion bomb known as Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki. Japan announced its surrender on August 15th. Historians continued to debate, and likely always will, the precise weight the bombings carried in that decision relative to other pressures Japan's leadership faced that same week, including the Soviet Union's declaration of war and invasion of Manchuria. What is not in dispute is that the physical and human devastation at Hiroshima was unlike anything a single weapon had produced before, and that survivors, known in Japan as hibakusha, would carry the physical and psychological consequences for the rest of their lives. Comparisons with what other nations were attempting at the time only underline how singular this achievement was. Nazi Germany's own nuclear program, hampered by resource shortages, the emigration of many leading physicists, and strategic miscalculations about how close a working weapon actually was, never progressed beyond early experimental reactor work and remained, by the war's end, years behind. The Soviet Union was pursuing its own program in parallel, aided substantially by intelligence gathered from the Manhattan Project itself, but would not test a working device until 1949. No other power in 1945 possessed anything remotely comparable to Little Boy, either in design maturity or in the industrial base required to produce the fissile material at scale. The gun-type uranium design used in Little Boy was, in fact, considered by its own creators reliable enough not to require a live test, a degree of confidence that reflected just how far ahead the American effort had moved, even as the far more complex plutonium implosion design used at Nagasaki required extensive testing to perfect. The legacy of Little Boy is inseparable from the wider legacy of the atomic age it inaugurated. Materially, the weapon itself was never replicated. It represented an early and, in later engineering terms, an inefficient approach that was quickly superseded by more compact, more powerful, and far more numerous designs during the Cold War arms race that followed almost immediately. Psychologically and politically, however, its impact has arguably never been matched. It demonstrated, in the starkest possible terms, that a single aircraft and a single bomb could now erase a city, a fact that reshaped military strategy, international diplomacy, and the public imagination for the rest of the century. The doctrine of nuclear deterrence, the tense standoffs of the Cold War, the decades of arms control negotiations that followed, all trace their origins back to that morning over Hiroshima. Remnants and records of the weapon and its effects can still be seen today. The Hiroshima Peace Memorial, preserved as a ruin at the epicenter of the blast, the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum, and a reconstructed casing of Little Boy itself on display at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Ohio. Debate over the decision to use the bomb, and over how history ought to weigh it, continues among historians and the public alike, and shows little sign of settling. Return, for a moment, to that runway on Tinian, to the roar of 4 engines straining under a load they had never carried before, to 12 men flying into a dawn none of them could fully comprehend. In the space of a single flight, a single release, a single detonation, The boundaries of what a weapon could do were redrawn forever. Before Hiroshima, destruction on that scale required armies, fleets, thousands of sorties flown over months. After it, the calculation changed in an instant and has never changed back. What Little Boy achieved, in purely mechanical terms, was the successful, controlled release of energy from the nucleus of an atom, translated into a single devastating explosion. What it achieved in human terms is something historians, survivors, and successive generations have spent 8 decades trying to fully reckon with, and likely never will finish reckoning with. It was, and remains, one of the starkest demonstrations in human history of how quickly scientific knowledge can outpace our capacity to absorb its consequences. The bomb itself no longer exists in any operational form. Its design was rendered obsolete within a few short years by weapons of far greater power and sophistication. But the moment it created, the line it drew across the 20th century between what had been and what came after, has never been erased, and very possibly never will be.